It's easy to imagine the Beatles as four best friends riding the wave of fame together, smiling in matching suits, cracking jokes, changing music forever. But behind the curtain, the cracks had already started forming long before anyone realized. The bond that once made them unstoppable was slowly being pulled apart by fame, exhaustion, and silence that said more than words ever could. The turning point came in August 1967, when their manager Brian Epstein suddenly passed. He wasn't just the man who booked their shows, he was the glue that held everything together. Without him, the Beatles lost their anchor. Brian was the one who balanced the egos, calmed the storms, and made sure every argument ended with laughter instead of bitterness. After he was gone, there was no one left to play referee. Paul McCartney tried to step up as the organizer, pushing the others to keep the momentum going. But instead of unity, it sparked resentment. John Lennon, dealing with his own restlessness and drug habits, started to drift away, searching for something deeper than pop music. George Harrison was growing frustrated too. His songwriting had evolved into something powerful and spiritual, but his ideas were constantly overlooked. Imagine pouring your heart into a song only to watch it shoved aside because it didn't have Lennon-McCartney's name on it. That kind of frustration doesn't just disappear, it builds. Then came the White Album. On the surface, it was another Beatles masterpiece, but behind the scenes it was chaos. Each of them recorded parts separately, barely speaking, often replacing one another's instrument tracks in secret. The friendship that had fueled their rise was quietly dissolving. Even Ringo, the peacemaker, walked out during the sessions, saying he wasn't feeling like a Beatle anymore. By this point, it wasn't the Beatles against the world, it was the Beatles against each other. The press didn't see it yet, but inside Abbey Road, the magic that had once united four young men from Liverpool was fading fast. And though they still smiled for the cameras, that brotherhood had already broken. What came next would turn quiet tension into open conflict, the kind that would finally end the world's most famous band. Because the unraveling was just beginning, but the real explosion was still to come. By the end of 1968, the Beatles were living in two different worlds, one in name, the other in spirit. They were still the Beatles to millions, but inside the studio, it felt more like four strangers trapped in the same room. Every creative decision turned into an argument, every session dragged like a bad dream. The magic was still there, but it came with tension so thick, you could almost hear it in the recordings. The business side didn't help either. After Epstein's death, their new company, Apple Corps, was supposed to be a dream project, part record label, part creative hub, but instead, it became a financial disaster. Everyone had a different opinion about how to run it. Paul wanted to bring in the Eastman family, his future in-laws, to manage things. John pushed for Alan Klein, a bold, controversial businessman who'd worked with the Rolling Stones. George and Ringo sided with John, and just like that, the group split down the middle, not musically, but legally. Recording Let It Be was meant to heal the wounds, but it only deepened them. Cameras were rolling for a planned documentary, capturing every uncomfortable glance, every sigh, every cold exchange. Fans would later see it all. The band that once defined harmony, now struggling to play a single song without arguing. There's a moment in that footage when George quietly says to Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." It's polite, but it's heartbreaking. You can feel years of frustration packed into that one sentence. Meanwhile, John's attention had shifted almost completely toward Yoko Ono, who was by his side at nearly every session. Paul didn't hide his irritation, George kept his distance, and the dynamic that once felt like family now felt fractured beyond repair. By 1970, it was clear the end was near. On April 10th, Paul McCartney released a simple press statement saying he was no longer working with the Beatles. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but its impact was explosive. Headlines around the world screamed that the Beatles were done. Fans cried. Others refused to believe it. John later said he'd already quit months earlier. He just hadn't gone public. The dream was officially over. The band that defined the 1960s had shattered under its own weight. But what followed wasn't the silence everyone expected. It was the start of four separate stories, each more unpredictable than the last. Because the breakup wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what came after. When the Beatles ended, no one took it harder than Paul McCartney. To the outside world, he looked fine. Still wealthy, still famous, still one of the greatest songwriters alive. But behind closed doors, Paul was falling apart. The band he'd built his entire life around was gone, and the world was quietly blaming him for it. Newspapers called him the man who broke up the Beatles. Fans turned cold. Even some of his old bandmates weren't returning his calls. Paul retreated into isolation on his farm in Scotland with his wife, Linda. He stopped shaving, stopped going out, stopped caring. Friends described him as withdrawn, bitter, and lost. He later admitted he was drinking too much and struggling to find any purpose outside of the Beatles. "I didn't know what to do with myself," he said years later. It felt like an impossible act to follow, but deep down, Paul knew he couldn't stay down forever. He had to write. It was the only thing that had ever made sense to him. With a small tape recorder and a few instruments, he started recording what would become his first solo album, McCartney. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect. But that was the point. It was raw, emotional, and personal. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed showed that even stripped of the Beatles' production, Paul still had the gift. The critics were divided. Some praised his honesty, others said it sounded unfinished, but fans could hear something real again. It was the sound of a man rebuilding himself from nothing. Soon after, he formed a new band, Wings, with Linda on keyboards. Everyone doubted them. People said Paul would never recreate the magic, but he didn't try to. Instead, he reinvented himself. Albums like Band on the Run and Venus and Mars proved that McCartney could still fill stadiums, write timeless hits, and lead a new generation of fans who hadn't even been alive when the Beatles first ruled the charts. Still, the shadow of the Beatles never left him. Every interview, every review, every success came with the same question. Yeah, but is it as good as the Beatles? It haunted him, but it also drove him. Paul never stopped creating, never stopped touring, never stopped proving that life after the Beatles didn't have to be smaller, just different. And while Paul was finding his rhythm again, another Beatle was quietly preparing to show the world what he'd been holding back all along. For years, George Harrison had lived in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney. To fans, he was the quiet Beatle, but that nickname couldn't have been further from the truth. George wasn't quiet, he was ignored. Every time he brought a new song to the studio, it was treated like an afterthought. He once joked that getting even 2 songs on a Beatles album felt like winning the lottery. But inside, that constant rejection was eating him alive. When the band finally split, George didn't grieve, he exhaled. For the first time in years, he was free to create without limits, and he wasted no time. Within months, he poured his energy into what would become All Things Must Pass, a triple album packed with songs that had been bottled up during his Beatles years. It wasn't just a solo record, it was a revelation. When the album dropped in 1970, the world finally heard the version of George they'd been missing. Songs like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life carried a spiritual depth that stood out from the pop world around him. They weren't just hits, they felt like healing. My Sweet Lord became the first solo #1 single by a former Beatle, and for the first time, George was the one in the spotlight. But fame came with a price. My Sweet Lord was soon caught in a messy lawsuit claiming it was too similar to another song. He's So Fine. George said the similarity was unintentional, but the legal fight dragged on for years. Instead of letting it break him, he handled it with calm humor, turning the ordeal into a life lesson. Beyond the charts, George's focus shifted toward something deeper: purpose. He organized the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first major benefit concerts in history, bringing together icons like Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton to raise millions for humanitarian relief. It proved that George's heart was as powerful as his music. Through the years, he continued exploring faith, gardening, filmmaking, and quiet living. He joined the Traveling Wilburys in the late 80s, showing that even surrounded by legends like Tom Petty and Roy Orbison, George could still hold his own effortlessly. He never chased fame again. He didn't need to. George had already found what the others were still searching for: peace. But while George was finding freedom and faith, John Lennon was about to take a very different path, one that would shake the world in ways no one saw coming. After the breakup, John Lennon wasted no time reinventing himself. To him, the Beatles had become a cage: fame without freedom, applause without truth. Once he walked away, he wasn't chasing hits anymore. He was chasing honesty. With Yoko Ono by his side, John dove into a new kind of music: raw, emotional, and deeply personal. His first solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, was nothing like the polished pop of the Beatles. It was stripped down, almost painfully so. Songs like Mother and Working Class Hero didn't just tell stories, they tore open wounds. Fans expecting the next Hey Jude got something much heavier: a man confronting his demons head-on. But John wasn't just transforming musically. He became more outspoken, more political, and far more unpredictable. He spoke out about peace, war, and government hypocrisy. He and Yoko staged bed-ins for peace, gave controversial interviews, and lived life like a public performance piece. Some saw it as genius. Others thought he'd lost his mind. Either way, John didn't care. He was finally being himself, unfiltered, unafraid, and often misunderstood. By the mid-70s, though, the chaos caught up with him. The fame, the activism, the pressure, it all became too much. He called it his lost weekend, a wild emotional stretch filled with drinking, heartbreak, and self-discovery. But after that storm, he returned to something simple: family. When his son Sean was born in 1975, John stepped out of the spotlight completely, becoming a full-time dad. For 5 years, he didn't record a single song. He cooked, read, and took walks in Central Park like an ordinary man who'd finally found peace. In 1980, he decided to come back. Double Fantasy marked his return to music: older, wiser, and ready for a new chapter. But just as it began, it ended. John's life was cut short outside his New York home, leaving the world stunned. The Beatles were truly gone, and music would never be the same again. Ringo Starr, meanwhile, took a very different road. He didn't chase revolutions or headlines, he just wanted to play. In the 70s, Ringo quietly released hit singles like It Don't Come Easy and Photograph, proving he had charm beyond the drum kit. Over the decades, he became the Beatles' steady heartbeat, touring with his all-star band, spreading good energy, and reminding fans that not everything after the Beatles had to end in tragedy or tension. Ringo became what the others couldn't always be: happy, grounded, and at peace with his legacy. But even with one gone and the others apart, whispers of a reunion never died. Because somehow, the Beatles' story refused to stay over. Even after the breakup, the Beatles never truly left the public eye. Their shadow lingered over everything, every chart, every interview, every rumor that hinted they might somehow, someday, get back together. Fans refused to believe it was really over. Every time two of them were spotted in the same city, headlines exploded. Every quote was dissected like a secret message. The world was obsessed with the idea of a reunion, even if the Beatles themselves had already moved on. But in the middle of all this came one of the strangest pop culture conspiracies ever, the infamous Paul is dead theory. It started with a college newspaper article claiming Paul had secretly died years earlier and been replaced by a look-alike. Fans began tearing through album covers and lyrics looking for clues. The barefoot Paul on Abbey Road, the backward messages, the cryptic artwork. It was completely untrue, of course. Paul was very much alive. But the rumor spread like wildfire. Even the band found it darkly funny, joking about it years later. But it showed just how much the world still needed the Beatles. People couldn't accept that their heroes were just human. By the mid-70s, a few Beatles crossed paths again, never as a full group, but enough to spark hope. George played on a few of Ringo's songs. John and Paul nearly reunited in 1974 during a jam session that fans still talk about today. But a full reunion never happened, and after John's passing, that dream became impossible. Still, the legacy didn't fade. In the 1990s, something incredible happened. The surviving Beatles came together for the Beatles Anthology Project, part documentary, part resurrection. Using old demo tapes John had recorded at home, Paul, George, and Ringo created two new Beatles songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. Hearing John's voice again, layered with the others decades later, was like time folding in on itself. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was closure, and even that wasn't the end. In the 2000s, remasters, remixes, and documentaries reignited the Beatles' influence for new generations. The 2021 Get Back documentary pulled fans even closer, showing the band's humanity, the laughter, tension, and love that held them together until the very end. More than 50 years after they split, the Beatles' story still refuses to fade. Every new release, every uncovered recording, every fan theory breathes life back into their legend. Because the Beatles didn't just change music, they changed what it meant to dream. And even after all this time, their story still isn't finished. When the Beatles ended, it felt like the world had lost its soundtrack. But what no one realized then was that the end of the Beatles wasn't really an ending at all. It was a transformation. Each member took a piece of the band's spirit and carried it in a different direction, turning heartbreak into reinvention. Paul McCartney became the craftsman, rebuilding himself from the ruins and proving that melody could still move mountains. George Harrison became the seeker, using music as a path to peace and purpose. John Lennon became the truth-teller, fearless and flawed, shining light on everything people were too afraid to face. And Ringo Starr? He became the heartbeat, steady, joyful, reminding everyone that love and rhythm can outlast anything. Together, even apart, they shaped modern music in ways that can't be measured. You can still hear their fingerprints everywhere, in rock, pop, indie, even hip-hop samples. Every young artist chasing honesty, every songwriter searching for meaning, every fan who believes music can change the world, they're all walking a path the Beatles paved. But maybe the most powerful part of their story isn't what they created while they were together. It's what they left behind after they split. They showed the world that endings don't have to mean failure. Sometimes they're just new beginnings wearing a disguise. The Beatles didn't fade into history, they evolved into it. Their music became a mirror for every generation that followed, and that's why, even now, their story refuses to die. Every few years, a new documentary, a remix, or an unearthed track reminds the world just how alive their legacy still is. The faces age, the formats change, but the feeling never does. Because at its core, the Beatles' story isn't just about four men from Liverpool. It's about what happens when creativity, friendship, and chaos collide and somehow create something timeless. So, maybe the Beatles never truly broke up. Maybe they just changed form, their songs echoing through time, their influence reborn with every new listener who hits play. Because legends don't really end. They just keep playing on a different frequency.